A 12-year-old boy leaves home for school and disappears somewhere along a 4-block walk. Within hours, his family begins receiving ransom demands. The price reaches $500,000. Then, the kidnappers send proof that this is not an empty threat. The boy's finger is left in a restaurant bathroom with a recording of him pleading for his family to pay. The money is supposed to come from his older brother. His older brother is a Harlem crack dealer. Police believe the kidnappers know exactly who they are targeting. But the brother does not want to handle the crisis the way investigators want him to. He tries to negotiate. The calls stop. And before the missing boy comes home, his older brother is found shot dead in a remote section of the Bronx. More than $2,000 is still on the body. Robbery does not explain it. The dead man is Richard Porter, Rich Porter, 25 years old, West Harlem. A man who later street history would transform into one of the legendary names of the crack era. But contemporary police descriptions were more restrained. Investigators called Porter a middle-level crack dealer. They also estimated that his organization moved roughly $50,000 worth of crack in a week, and said several street sellers worked for him. Those two descriptions are not really contradictory. The title was modest. The cash flow was not. $50,000 in weekly street sales did not mean $50,000 went directly into Rich Porter's pocket. Product had to be purchased. Sellers had to be supplied. Money moved back through the chain. But it did mean Rich was operating above the level of a man personally making every sale. Police believed he had people beneath him. Access to cocaine mattered. Reliable supply mattered. And the more sellers someone could keep supplied, the more cash could move through the organization without the leader standing on the sidewalk himself. Police described several sellers rather than one massive organization. Each seller needed product, and cash from those sales had to return up the chain so more cocaine could be purchased. The $50,000 weekly estimate described street volume, not Rich's personal profit. But repeated cash turnover across several sellers was enough to make even a so-called middle-level dealer look liquid enough for criminals to imagine a 6-figure ransom. That was enough to make Rich visible. Neighbors knew he had money. Police knew he had money. Other dealers knew he had money. And whoever took his little brother believed there was enough money around Rich Porter to make a $500,000 ransom demand worth attempting. He drove an expensive sports car equipped with a mobile telephone. He carried cash. He had sellers working Harlem streets. Neighbors also remembered a more public side of the money. The previous summer, they said, Rich had paid for a neighborhood block party with free food and drinks. That kind of spending did something street revenue alone could not. It turned private profit into public reputation. People could see who was doing well. And by late 1989, Rich Porter was visible enough that his family could become leverage. The missing child was Rich's younger brother. Contemporary newspaper reports called him William Porter. Later federal filings and family accounts used Donnell Porter. They were describing the same child. William Donnell Porter, known in later accounts simply as Donnell, was 12 years old and lived with his family at 155 West 132nd Street. Public School 92 was only 4 blocks from the Porter home. On the morning of December 5, 1989, Donnell left for school. He never arrived. The distance matters. This was not a child disappearing during a long subway ride or while crossing the city. He vanished during a short neighborhood walk that should have taken only minutes. By that afternoon, the family knew he was missing. Then the ransom calls began. The kidnappers wanted Rich's money. Police said the demand reached approximately $500,000. That amount was not random. Whoever made the demand believed Rich either had access to that kind of cash or could reach people who did. The kidnapping had turned his reputation into a price. On December 6th, one caller demanded to speak directly with Rich. By then, the amount being discussed had come down to approximately $350,000. Rich said he could produce $200,000. The caller said he would contact him again. Instead, the family was given instructions that led to a McDonald's near West 125th Street and Broadway. A family representative went inside. In the restroom was the proof the kidnappers had promised: a piece of Donnell's right index finger and a cassette recording. Police later described the recording as Donnell pleading with his family to get the money. There was no need for the kidnappers to explain the threat after that. The family understood exactly what they were dealing with. The abductors had taken a 12-year-old child because they believed his brother had drug money, and they were willing to injure the boy to move the negotiation. Later that night, around 9 o'clock, another demand came: approximately $350,000. Rich again said he could produce $200,000. The caller said he would call back within minutes. He did not. At roughly 10 that night, the Porter family contacted police. That decision did not suddenly make the situation easier. Investigators wanted information. They wanted control over communications. They wanted the family to cooperate in a way that might create evidence and give police a chance to identify whoever was making the calls. Rich apparently wanted more control himself. Contemporary investigators later said he did not cooperate fully and seemed to be trying to negotiate privately. His reasons were never reduced to one simple statement, but the pressures are easy to see. Rich was involved in the drug business. Inviting police deeper into his life carried its own risks. If kidnappers believed law enforcement was controlling the exchange, Donnell could be in greater danger. And in a street economy built on relationships, suppliers, and secrecy, Rich also had information about his own business that he had no reason to volunteer. So he tried to work between two systems: police on one side, street connections on the other. The kidnappers controlled the one thing neither side could guarantee: Donnell's safety. On December 10th, the family received another message. Police said a child was approached in Harlem by an unidentified woman and given a note for the Porters. The message said the kidnappers still wanted money. It also indicated that Donnell needed medical attention. Then the trail went quiet. There was no successful ransom exchange, no return, no clear new demand. Every day without contact changed the situation. Rich could gather money. He could ask questions. He could use people he trusted to look for information. But he did not know exactly who had his brother, where Donnell was being held, or whether the people negotiating with him were the same people making decisions about the boy. And while the kidnapping tightened around his family, Rich was still operating inside a drug world where trust already had a price. His police history showed how long he had been in that environment. Contemporary reporting said Rich had been convicted of drug possession in April 1984 and weapons possession later that year. Police said he served a 1-year sentence. Later, family and street accounts would place his entry into drug dealing even earlier. By the second half of the 1980s, what matters is clearer. Rich had returned to Harlem during a period when crack was producing extraordinary street revenue. His operation was large enough for several sellers to work beneath him. His cash flow was visible, and his business depended on access to people who could supply cocaine in quantities large enough to keep those sellers working. That is where Azie Faison and Alpo Martinez enter the story. Azie knew Rich from the Harlem drug world and later became one of the most important first-hand narrators of the era. Alpo was another friend and business associate moving through the same circle. Popular culture would eventually compress the three men into something close to a permanent partnership. Reality was less organized. Each man could have his own interests, his own customers, his own suppliers, his own opportunities. They could help each other without operating as one company. That distinction becomes important because access to supply was one of the most valuable things a dealer could possess. If two men were buying cocaine from the same connection, the price each man paid mattered. The quantity mattered. Whether one man could buy directly while another had to go through an intermediary mattered. A difference of only a few $1,000s per kilogram became serious money when repeated over multiple kilograms. A supplier was not simply a contact in a telephone book. A good connection could determine margins, reliability, and whether a dealer could continue supplying the people beneath him. Direct access could also remove an intermediary. If one associate bought from the source and resold to another, even a modest markup repeated across several kilograms could become serious money without changing the final street price. So hiding a direct connection or misrepresenting the source price could damage not just one deal, but trust in every earlier transaction built on the same relationship. Alpo's ambitions were already moving beyond Harlem. Federal investigators would later describe him as a link between a New York cocaine organization and distribution networks around Washington, Northern Virginia, and Fredericksburg. His later operation became far larger than the neighborhood business associated with Rich in contemporary police reporting. That expansion meant Alpo needed dependable cocaine access. It also meant that deception over supply, pricing, or who controlled a connection could become more than a personal insult. It could cost enormous amounts of money. But in December 1989, police were not looking at Alpo Martinez as the answer to Rich Porter's story. They were looking at a kidnapping. Rich was still alive. Donnell was still missing. And investigators had no reason to know that another conflict was moving beside the ransom crisis. Then Rich disappeared. Police believed he was last seen alive in Harlem on January 3, 1990, in a black 1989 two-door Nissan. Investigators later circulated the vehicle's New York license plate, 7HL209, while trying to reconstruct where Rich had gone and who had been with him. Sometime after that last sighting, he was driven out of Harlem. At approximately 12:50 on the morning of January 4th, a passerby found a body near Orchard Beach Park in the Bronx. It was Rich Porter. He had been shot several times in the head and chest. Investigators searched the body. Identification was still there, so was cash. $2,239. The cash was still there. That changed the first interpretation of the murder. Rich was known to carry money. Police knew he was a drug dealer. If someone had simply decided to rob him, leaving more than $2,000 behind, made little sense. Investigators began considering other motives: a drug dispute, a rival, retaliation, the kidnapping. Someone who knew Rich was trying to assemble ransom money, someone inside his own circle. Police initially had no clean answer. They knew he had refused to handle the kidnapping entirely through them. They knew he had been trying to negotiate, and now he was dead before his brother had been recovered. For investigators, the timing made it impossible to ignore a possible connection between the two crimes. Had the kidnappers killed Rich? Had someone tried to take the ransom money? Had a rival used the crisis as an opportunity? Or was Rich's murder unrelated to Donnell's abduction? The money on his body kept the questions open. Then another homicide appeared on the same Harlem block. On January 16th, Stanley Harvey, 24, described as a drug-dealing associate of Rich Porter, was found shot to death inside an abandoned building at 149 West 132nd Street. Police considered whether the killings around the Porter Circle might be connected. But Rich's murder still did not solve the kidnapping. Donnell remained missing, and investigators still had no body. Nearly 8 weeks after the boy vanished, that changed. On January 28th, a man collecting cans along a bicycle path near the Hutchinson River Parkway's City Island exit found something wrapped in black plastic garbage bags. Inside was the body of a young boy. Police later counted 14 bags. The missing finger immediately gave investigators a reason to compare the body with the Porter kidnapping. The family identified him as William Porter. Donnell, the 12-year-old who had left West 132nd Street for school on December 5th. The medical examiner concluded that he had died from a blow to the head. His body was found less than a mile from the area where Rich's body had been discovered earlier that month. That proximity made one theory almost unavoidable. Perhaps the same people had killed both brothers. But in 1990, detectives still had separate pieces rather than one visible criminal enterprise. Donnell's case had begun as a ransom kidnapping. Rich's death looked like a targeted homicide inside the drug world. Proximity was not proof that one crew controlled both crimes. Years later, a broader racketeering investigation could compare old murder files with evidence about an organization accused of extortion, robbery, kidnapping, and murder. A later federal court opinion even noted that an investigator working the Preacher Crew case already knew the Porter family from the earlier investigation into Donnell's death. Years later, a very different explanation for Rich's death emerged. The name was Alpo Martinez. The distinction here is critical. Martinez was not convicted by a jury specifically for murdering Rich Porter. What happened came through Alpo's later federal cooperation and his own public account. After Rich's death, Alpo continued expanding in Washington, D.C. Federal authorities eventually built a major narcotics case around his organization. They described interstate cocaine trafficking, firearms, money laundering, and multiple killings. Martinez became a fugitive, was arrested, and eventually decided to cooperate with the government. Law enforcement sources said he admitted involvement in numerous murders. Years later, in a prison interview, later quoted by the New York Times, Alpo said directly that he had participated in killing Rich Porter. His explanation centered on money and deception inside their drug business. According to Alpo's version, Rich had misled him about access to a cocaine supplier. The issue was not simply friendship. It was what the supplier represented. If Rich had a direct connection and Alpo was paying a higher price through another route, Rich could profit from that difference, while Alpo believed they were dealing on equal terms. At kilogram quantities, those differences could become extremely expensive. Later retellings often reduce the entire conflict to a neat claim that Rich stole $300,000 from Alpo. The record is not that simple. There is a documented $300,000 transaction elsewhere in Alpo's federal history, involving money sent from a Crystal City hotel toward New York. That is not proof that Rich stole exactly $300,000 from Martinez. It is not proof that $300,000 was the established motive for Rich's murder. Alpo's later story was about being deceived in cocaine business and losing money because of it. Azie Faison later recalled confronting Martinez about Rich and hearing essentially the same explanation. Those are participant accounts. They were not what police knew when Rich's body was found at Orchard Beach. Alpo's later description of the killing was blunt. He said an accomplice first shot Rich in the chest. When Rich remained alive, Martinez said he shot him in the head. Later accounts identified the other man as Garrett Big Head Gary Terrell. The body was then left in the Bronx. That confession gave Rich's homicide a far more direct answer than investigators had in January 1990. But it also exposed the real shape of the crisis around him. The people holding Donnell apparently wanted Rich's money. According to Alpo, the person who killed Rich was not part of that ransom negotiation. He came from Rich's own business circle. The kidnapping and the murder had closed around Rich from opposite directions. An outside group had found leverage through his family. An inside relationship, according to Alpo's later account, had turned into a deadly dispute over trust, access, and money. The Porter family was now left with both outcomes. Rich was dead. Donnell was dead. But the kidnapping investigation did not end with the discovery of the boy's body. It eventually pointed into another Harlem criminal organization entirely. Clarence Preacher Heatley became one of the most important names. Federal prosecutors described Heatley as the leader of a violent organization commonly called the Preacher Crew or the Family. The organization operated in narcotics trafficking, but prosecutors also described a business built around robbery, extortion, kidnapping, assault, and murder. Drug dealers were particularly useful targets. They often operated with large amounts of cash. They could be reluctant to call police, and their families could provide leverage that a street robbery could not. A dealer might refuse to hand over money to a robber. A kidnapped relative changed the calculation. The broader federal record also documented a 1991 episode in which Preacher crew members stole approximately $119,000 during an armed robbery of a Queens department store, threatened employees, and kidnapped the manager, taking him away in his own car before releasing him in the Bronx. It was not the Porter kidnapping and did not establish the motive in Donnell's case, but it showed that abduction could be integrated into a profit-driven crime rather than existing only as an isolated personal act. Federal cases against Heatley's organization later described victims being abducted, held, and threatened while money was demanded from people around them. That made kidnapping more than a personal crime. It could function as an extortion method against a cash-heavy underground economy. The Porter case fit that pattern. Donnell had no drug territory, no cocaine supply, no crew. His value to the kidnappers came from one relationship. He was Rich Porter's little brother. Years later, federal prosecutors formally placed Donnell's murder inside their case against Heatley. A federal death penalty filing explicitly alleged that Clarence Heatley participated in the kidnapping, torture, and murder of Donnell Porter from December 5, 1989 into January 1990. That wording matters. It was a formal allegation by federal prosecutors. It should not be rewritten as a separate jury conviction specifically proving every act in the Porter kidnapping. Heatley later pleaded guilty in the broader federal racketeering case and received a life sentence. The federal filings showed that prosecutors considered Donnell's kidnapping part of the violent conduct surrounding the preacher crew. Another name that appears in later accounts is John Porter, also referred to in family and street histories as Johnny Apple Porter. Later accounts identify him as Donnell's uncle and describe a direct role in the kidnapping. Federal court records also place John Porter inside the broader investigation into the Heatley organization and identify the family relationship. But the exact role attributed to him in later family recollections should remain separate from what individual court filings conclusively established. That separation is important because Rich Porter's story became one of the most mythologized stories in Harlem. Different retellings often combine what police believed in 1990, what family members later said, what federal prosecutors alleged years later, and what movies dramatized into one clean narrative. The real record developed in stages. Police first knew a 12-year-old had been abducted. They knew somebody wanted Rich's money. They knew physical proof had been sent. Then Rich was murdered. His cash was left behind. Donnell was found dead. Years later, Alpo publicly explained Rich's killing from inside the drug world. And a separate federal racketeering investigation formally alleged that Clarence Heatley's organization was connected to the kidnapping and murder of Donnell. Outsiders had seen one crisis. The later cases revealed two. That is also why investigators faced such difficulty at the beginning. The Porter family existed inside a world where cooperating with police could carry consequences. The target of the ransom was himself a drug dealer. The suspected extortionists operated inside violent organizations. People with information could fear retaliation from several directions. And the man trying to negotiate for the victim had criminal relationships he was unlikely to explain completely to detectives. Police could monitor calls. They could search for the boy. They could investigate Rich's murder. What they could not immediately see was every organization operating around the same family. Popular culture eventually gave the story a much cleaner shape. In 2002, Paid in Full transformed the Harlem world of Azie Faison, Rich Porter, and Alpo Martinez into fictionalized characters. For many viewers, the film became the version they remembered. It captured the broad outline: young men making extraordinary money in the crack economy, expensive cars, friendship, a younger brother kidnapped for ransom, betrayal. But the documentary record is more complicated. Contemporary police did not describe Rich as the unquestioned king of Harlem. They called him a middle-level crack dealer whose organization was nevertheless moving roughly $50,000 in product each week. The kidnapping did not simply lead investigators to Alpo. Rich's murder and Donnell's abduction became separate criminal stories. Alpo's later confession explained Rich's death. Federal prosecutors later alleged that another organization was responsible for the kidnapping and killing of Donnell. Even the boy's name changed across the record. William in contemporary reporting, Donnell in later federal and family accounts. Azie survived and became one of the principal storytellers of that era. Alpo expanded into Washington, became a federal cooperator, and admitted multiple killings. Rich never made it past January 1990. His money had put him in a position where somebody believed $500,000 could be demanded from his family. His business put him around people for whom supplier access and pricing could become matters of enormous money. And while he was trying to solve the first problem, the second one reached him. When police found Rich near Orchard Beach, $2,239 was still on his body. The kidnappers wanted his money. His business world revolved around money. But whoever killed Rich left the money behind. Rich Porter had built a reputation around having cash. In the end, the cash was still there. The control was gone.